Nobody tells you that knowing your worth comes at a cost. They sell you the empowerment version. Know your worth. Protect your peace. Don't settle. But they leave out the part where acting on that requires you to give things up. Friends, places that you used to go to, things that you used to enjoy, versions of yourself that used to feel comfortable. And for a while, you're just sitting there in this strange in-between where the old thing is gone and the new thing hasn't developed yet. And that's where I am right now. And I want to talk about this because most of these conversations online are more about people performing confidence about decisions that they don't actually have certainty over. And they're decisions that they've already made, but I'm making mine in real time. In high school, I used to eat lunch sitting on the floor every day. And I want to be honest, it wasn't some confident statement at the time. It was just cold, it was uncomfortable, and it was a little embarrassing because all the other kids had friends that would basically save them seats at the main tables because we had a really small high school. But the kids sitting on the floor also had real bonds with each other. There was community down there, okay? Because nobody was performing. We weren't saving seats. There was no managing hierarchies. It was just sitting on the floor underneath the stairs, and it was genuine. And that contrast of performance at the tables versus the reality on the floor and belonging shows that performance and belonging are very different things. And I felt the same with my graduation. I never got my high school diploma. I never walked across the stage, and I refused to assign my value to graduating out of someone else's version of success over something that meant nothing to me. Because if high school sucks so much, if it didn't teach me anything, then why do I need to go with everyone else and be like, oh my God, I got my diploma, I'm so happy. It was lonely in the moment, but it was mine. And knowing your worth comes with a cost to proximity to people who benefited from doubting you. When you stop shrinking to fit what someone else needs, people get uncomfortable. And that discomfort gets read as loneliness. But it's just the absence that's left behind when you stop giving people your energy. And Schopenhauer wrote about this. He has this idea that he calls the porcupine dilemma. So porcupines huddle together when they're cold, and they spend most of their existence finding this optimal distance where they're close enough for warmth, but they're not poking each other because, of course, they're porcupines. And because the answer isn't to sit on the floor together, you have to act like these porcupines and find the right amount of space because you need people. And social connection is genuinely important. But there's a difference between sitting at the table versus sitting on the ground because you're afraid of what happens when you're not around anyone else. One of these examples is connection, and the other one is compliance that feels like connection until you stop complying. Another huge element of this is authority figures. Part of figuring out who you are while you're young is getting used to this feeling of not going along with things. I got suspended in school quite frequently, I think like 3 or 4 times. And what was actually happening, despite me being a pain in the ass, was I was practicing disagreement with authority when I thought authority was genuinely wrong. And getting used to that discomfort of going against the grain and learning that there was a social cost of non-compliance also taught me that non-compliance was survivable. And that is so important because the institutions we grew up with and relied on aren't delivering the same promise anymore. So these kids that learn to follow every rule and optimize for institutional approval and be popular and sit at the table with everyone else and follow the rules are fucked because that institution is no longer delivering value. So yeah, the weird kids who got in trouble for questioning things are probably better positioned for what the world looks like now. And that's not because rebellion or being weird is just inherently good. It's because that teaches you to think independently and deciding for yourself whether the default path or your path is actually your own is what life requires out of you now. It's what happiness needs. And Nietzsche wrote about this, that he had this idea about climbing higher into truth. And the further that you go into truth, the further you are isolated from society. And that doesn't mean that you're just superior to others. It means that just because people stop at a certain level of comfort in knowingness about the world doesn't mean that you have to. And if you keep moving, you'll simply be where they're not. So the wider your eyes are opened, the less that other people will actually look at you and see you and acknowledge you. And that creates a gap, because the time between leaving what you were and then arriving at what you want to be, you outgrow people. You're shedding your feathers and turning into something new. And I'm in that gap right now. And some days it feels like failing. It feels a little bit isolating, but some days it feels like the most alive I've ever been. And creating my own path has created more meaning than a lifetime of living someone else's story could ever do for me. And both are true at once, which is kind of annoying, because you need a certain degree of uncertainty, but you also need connection. So establish the balance, but don't live a life that's borrowed. And I'd like to give an example of my ex-best friend. And that was a time where knowing my worth cost me something was real. And that was when I left my apartment. I dipped out on the lease with him because I realized that the dynamic wasn't good for me, and that being around the energy of him was holding me back. So I left, and I canceled my lease, and we're not friends anymore because of it. In fact, he hates me. And making that decision was isolating, because I lost a relationship that was worth 5 or 6 years of my life, and I had to form everything from the ground up. And it's still isolating, but doing that represented a change that I wanted to make in my character, that I said, you know what, this is a bad influence on me. I want to write my own story. I can't be dragged down by someone else's energy. And staying there would have required me to be a smaller version of the self that I was trying to be. Because sometimes the right distance will improve your character, and it has for mine. And the hard part is that when we're young and this path isn't set, you have to be vicious about who you let in. And that doesn't mean to be cruel, but vicious, deliberate, and at times cold. And so I started asking one question about everyone in my life: are you making me sharper? Are you making me better? It's not about being comfortable. Are you actually making me a better version of myself? Are you bringing me closer to the thing that I want to be? And are you someone who actually challenges me to think? And a lot of people don't make that cut. And if you begin to open your eyes, you realize that most of the people you surround yourself with actually don't really care. And you have to be quiet for a while before knowing how to have the right people show up. And without anyone, it can often feel weird. But when you start holding yourself to a different standard, you actually become more attractive to other people, because realness, originality, and genuinity is falling apart in a society. And people respect that. Okay, so yes, knowing your worth is often lonely sometimes, but modern society says that being lonely is wrong. Why does being lonely have to be wrong? Being lonely is where the greatest tales of adventure, like the Odyssey, Odysseus, he had to leave his home kingdom and go on a ship and explore and got lost at sea, but in doing so, he had the greatest adventure known to man. And we have lost space for this modern day of pilgrimage, because we are so assigned to our community that we grew up in, and our ideas of safety, that we never leave that circle. So we don't actually have time to grow into manhood, womanhood, or personhood. And the times where your character is challenged the most is actually where you'll experience the most growth. For example, when I left the living situation with my best friend, I had to challenge what my values were, because at the time my values were allowing me to stay with him. But what I realized is I wanted to be a better, a kinder, a less selfish person. And that led me to actually baptizing myself and representing a true change in my life to become who I am now. And that has become a continual process where I have to double check these moments of like, oh, am I stagnating? Am I lonely enough? Am I independent enough? And it'll ebb and flow. But as long as you keep this higher goal of adventure in your head, then that is where you will truly grow. And in true growth, we become closer to happiness. So yeah, knowing your worth is lonely. Not always, not forever, not just during the gap. It's during this in-between, during the period where the old version of yourself is gone and the new one is forming. The kids on the floor at lunch weren't losers. I swear, I promise I wasn't. They were just done performing. The kid who skipped graduation wasn't a failure. He just refused to let someone else define what his success looked like. He just refused to let someone else tell him how to live his life. The person who left their apartment, the person who disagreed with the teacher, their parents, their peers weren't bad kids. They weren't bad friends. They just understood that some distance is necessary for growth. So sit on the floor where you feel like you actually belong. Skip the graduation if it doesn't mean anything to you. Leave the apartment if you have to. Leave your hometown, leave your parents. It's okay to be a little bit vicious about it because you can be generous later in life. But also go home and eat some ice cream and go enjoy your life and make sure that you have friends because the gap is uncomfortable, but you're allowed to laugh in it. And you're allowed to be in this process and still have a good time. And that's not called a contradiction. It's just called being a person. So go ahead and be lonely. But don't let it hold you back from happiness. Let me know what you think. Have you ever experienced loneliness? Are you lonely? How do you plan to grow into your personhood? Let's discuss it in the comments below. Take care.